Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Schreiber, one of your mission chairs. It's nice to see you all here, and for those who I can't see on the other side of the screen on the bus, it's nice to see you too. Kol hakavod to you for taking a day out of your life and going to Washington to do something that's incredibly important, which is to be there, to establish relationships, to let people know that the issues that are facing us and our brothers and sisters in Israel are of critical importance to us as Americans, and that they should be to our members of Congress as well. For reasons that go beyond tactical, Israel's a bulwark against the encroaching forces of darkness that target us. For reasons that go beyond strategy and strategic, right? Our goals are served by having Israel pursue our interests there, but that are philosophical and ideological, that join us at our very core in terms of values, that make Israel something incredibly important to the United States in ways that go beyond transactional. And the only way you can do that is by being there. And one of the things we're going to ask you to talk about when you're there is the BDS movement and the strategic danger that it places Israel in, and that therefore, by extension, it places the United States in the future. And when I get to the end of the presentation, I'll talk to you about the specific things we would like you to ask the members you meet with to do on BDS. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about BDS so we all understand what we're talking about. In 1968, according to Seymour Lipset, who at one time was the vice chair of the United States Institute for Peace, he's a very accomplished academic who died relatively recently, began his life as a socialist. At a meeting, at a dinner in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1968 that was attended by Martin Luther King, in response to some harshly critical statements made by an African-American student, Martin Luther King said, "When people criticize Zionism, they mean Jews. You are talking anti-Semitism." That's Martin Luther King more than 50 years ago, knowing exactly what that kind of criticism is about. And that is BDS in a nutshell. Right? The BDS movement is the boycott, divest, and sanctions movement, which aims, according to its stated overt goals, to cause Israel, which it seeks to label as an apartheid state, to be cut off from connections with the rest of the world, and ultimately to delegitimize Israel, to strike away at its underpinnings of safety and security, to leave it isolated, so that it cannot survive, and ultimately, as was the case in South Africa, the hope is that Israel will collapse under its own weight if the BDS movement is successful. That's the stated overt goal. Everyone here should take some heart in the fact that, for the most part, the overt goals of the BDS movement have been almost entirely unsuccessful. But there's a covert goal that is much more dangerous. And it is the long-term game that the people who are proponents of the BDS movement, which include outfits like Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other terror-supporting entities who have America in their sights as much as they have Israel. Their long-term goal, their not stated goal, their covert goal is by simply putting Israel in a conversation in the same sentence as the word apartheid, discrimination, a human rights abusing state, that they gradually make it okay. They gradually make it acceptable. In fact, it becomes fashionable to talk about Israel in a way that everyone in this room recognizes, as Martin Luther King did all those years ago, as pure anti-Semitism. And what we're going to talk about with you is how you can talk about this with our elected representatives so that they understand not only the strategic threat that the BDS movement represents, but also how they can distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel. And remember, we are not saying that Israel is above criticism, just like the United States of America is not above criticism. I forgot whose statement it was who said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others, right? Churchill, right? Churchill. Thank you. So in a democratic society, the democratic government is open to critique. And we're not saying that people have to share our opinions. What we are saying, though, is that when you have a movement that is designed to delegitimize, demonize, and impose double standards, which we'll talk about in a moment, on the only Jewish state in the world, the homeland of the Jews, where Jews have had a connection for millennia, which seeks to strip alone among all national movements of all stripes, of all ethnicities and races, only the Jewish state of legitimacy. That's anti-Semitism. We'll come to that in a moment. So first, a little bit about the sources of the BDS movement. The BDS movement was founded by a Palestinian Arab, although he was born in Qatar and grew up in Egypt, named Omar Barghouti. You may recognize his last name. There's a clan called Barghouti that is in Israel. He's a member of that clan, although, as I said, born in Qatar, grew up in Egypt, got a master's of ethics from Tel Aviv University. This is the person who is the head, the front man for the BDS movement, married an Israeli Arab, and therefore has Israeli citizenship. He lives in Akko. Omar Barghouti came up with this idea, which is grounded in the anti-normalization movement, which was founded by various Palestinian Arabs as a way to try and prevent ground-up peace. Think about this for a moment. Right? Everyone here remembers the attacks on the SodaStream company. SodaStream was a company that happened to have been on the other side of the Green Line. It employed Palestinian Arabs in the same capacities in which it employed Jews who worked. They were given breaks 5 times a day to pray. They were given their own prayer room. The Palestinian Arabs didn't just work on the assembly line. They were supervisors. They were managers. That was extraordinarily dangerous and provocative to people in the Palestinian movement who fear the idea that there could ever be normalized relations between Palestinian Arabs on the one hand and Jews, Israelis on the other hand. By the way, if you know anything about Arabic, when Arabs speak about Israelis, they call them Yahud. That's Arabic, not for Israeli, it's Jew. That's how they mean the term. For them, they understand that when they're talking about Israelis, they mean Jews. And the anti-normalization movement said, oh my God, if people start to live in peace with their neighbors and start to see that there's actually something in this for them, namely a better life, a peaceful life, a successful life, a life in which they can live side by side with Jews, that was extraordinarily threatening for them. And so therefore they came up with this anti-normalization movement, and to put it into action, the BDS movement is the action arm of the anti-normalization movement. And it seeks not only to prevent investment in Israel, but it seeks to prevent any Israelis from being able to participate in civil society events throughout the world. It has academic and cultural elements. So for example, artists are pressured not to perform in Israel, and Israeli artists are not permitted to perform, according to the BDS movement, around the world, and there have been performances that have been canceled. It tries to get academics to boycott their Israeli counterparts. Think about that. Remember that when Hitler carried out the final solution, the final part of the final solution were the gas chambers and the concentration camps. The beginning of the final solution was the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses, which originally, the first time around, fell flat. By the second time around, it had the support of the great number of Germans in the 30s. How did it happen? Because they gradually took away the idea of treating Jews as equal. So BDS, taking a playbook straight from the Nazi regime, is trying to talk about boycotts, because merely talking about it and saying it over and over again helps to delegitimize, in their view, and frankly, anyone who sees where this is going, who sees what's going on college campuses today, who are sending their kids to colleges around the country and understands what it means where the anti-Semitism is coming from the left. It's coming from the BDS movement. So, what do? They have their overt goals, their covert goals. It's our job to stop that. It's our job to stop it because when American values are under attack in this disingenuous way around the globe, what do I mean by that? I mean the BDS movement takes the oldest hatred in the world, anti-Semitism, which is a wolf, and it puts the sheep's clothing of the language of human rights over it to make it kosher. They wouldn't use the word kosher, they'd say halal, but you understand what we're talking about. So they go in and they say, it's human rights, Israel discriminates, Israel's an apartheid state. But of course, these things are directly contradicted by the facts as we all know them. And in fact, I've done this, I think every time I've done this presentation for people, I'll update you on where the numbers come out. But I talked earlier about the 3D test, that's Natan Sharansky's test. Natan Sharansky, of course, everyone here knows, currently was an MK in Israel, was a refusenik. 1985, came to the United States being released from the Soviet Gulag. And he, having experienced anti-Semitism, state-sponsored anti-Semitism, firsthand, came up with a definition so how you can differentiate between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And that's his 3D test. Does the criticism seek to delegitimize Israel? That's how you know they're over the line. Does it impose double standards? For example, are the critiques that are being leveled at Israel things that are not ever leveled at any other country in the world? As just one example, Israel is criticized for taking defensive measures to protect its citizens. Whether those measures are actual military maneuvers or whether those measures are securing borders or entry points. But every country in the world secures its borders and entry points. Evidently, that's become something of a hot button topic these days. But even among those who, for whatever reason, say you shouldn't have walls, they obviously agree that there should be controls. And yet, for doing what any other country would do, and in fact, for going beyond it. For example, Israel is at the forefront of how to conduct warfare, asymmetrical warfare, in a humanitarian way that every other Western country looks to Israel at the forefront of to determine how to do it, to minimize civilian casualties, right? Israel, for example, pioneered the idea of the knock on the roof. So Israel in real time, if it knows it has a high-value military target in a civilian area, will drop a very low-impact, low-explosive bomb on the roof to tell everyone in the building to get out so Israel can then bomb that place. There's no other country in the world that does that exposes its own military and takes tremendous risks militarily on the battlefield, as well as for peace, right? Israel gave up incredible amounts of territory in the service of trying to get to peace. Israel unilaterally, forget Sinai for a moment, where Israel actually withdrew its own citizens. Just look at Gaza. Israel left there in 2005. And what did Israel get in return? Just last month, 700 rockets. Yet Israel keeps taking these kinds of risks. Nevertheless, somehow to the BDS movement and people who talk about it, that they say Israel has to do more. There's no civilized country in the world that would do more. In fact, if rockets were raining into northern New York State from Canada and into Texas from Mexico, I assure you that our leaders would not respond with the kind of restraint that the Israelis have. In fact, the American public would demand it. That's a double standard. And there's another way you know it's a double standard. There's an NGO, a non-governmental organization called Freedom House. It's been around since 1941. Its stated purpose is it's an independent watchdog organization dedicated to the expansion of freedom and democracy around the world. You can look it up. It's freedomhouse.org. And every year they do a ranking of all the countries in the world, and they rank them all on a 0 to 100 point scale. And they also rank them based on that scale how they come out as to whether they are free, partly free, or not free, based on criteria that they establish and give a point scale to. They've been doing this for many, many years. Everyone here may be very interested to know that the United States score has come down because of Freedom House's view about the current administration's attacks on democratic institutions. So they don't pull punches. And by the way, they're sharply critical of Israel in many ways, but in legitimate ways. So you have Freedom House that does this 0 to 100 scale. Israel, by the way, is free, totally free. Israel's score on the 100-point scale is 78. That puts Israel ahead of about 135 other countries in the world. Notice there's no BDS movement for any of those other countries in the world by people who seem to be so concerned about human rights, including, by the way, Turkey. Turkey's score is 31. Russia, which is at 20. Cuba at 14. And China at 11, right? Those are just some of the countries that no one is up in arms about, that it's supposedly trampling on human rights and people should be boycotting, divesting, and sanctioning them. People may say they should impose tariffs, but no one's talking about boycotting, right? In the Middle East and North Africa region alone, it's really stunning. There are 420 million people who live in one of the most wretched parts of the globe when it comes to human rights. There are only 2 countries out of 21 countries and territories, according to Freedom House, in that area of the world that are actually ranked free. There's Israel with a score of 78 and Tunisia with a score of 69. 3 of the worst human rights violators of the least free countries on the face of this planet are in the Middle East and North Africa. And those are, in descending order, Libya with a score on the 0 to 100 point scale of 9. Saudi Arabia, 7. And Syria, which is 0. 420 million people living in poverty, living in conditions of the worst human rights. Only 5% of them are free. 8 million of them are lucky enough to live in Israel. All of these other Arab countries, as well as Persian, Iran's score is 18. That's 80 million people living in a country that's not free with a score, Freedom House score of 18, 1-8. Doesn't even get a 2 before it. And the BDS movement is singling out Israel for opprobrium. By the way, there are many other countries in the world that are partially free. For example, you have Singapore is a 51, Nepal 54, Mexico is 63. The BDS movement out there saying, my God, we need to improve Mexico. No, they target the only Jewish state in the world. And to give you an idea that Freedom House is not necessarily a fan of Israel just because it's Israel, Israel's score was 81 last year. It came down in part because of the legislation that was passed by the Knesset this past year that declared Israel to be a Jewish state. So, when that kind of ordering of priorities is advanced by people who claim to be concerned about human rights, it should cause people to give that a second look, and a third look, and a fourth look, and a fifth look. And it just so happens, in case anyone misses it, that people who support the BDS movement and the BDS movement itself tries to make its case to the world. They've been working, by the way, the movement is more than 20 years old. They're finally realizing that maybe they should clean up their act a little bit if they're going to have any success on their overt as opposed to their covert goals. So they're trying to scrub their public materials, but at the end of the day, it's like the story of the scorpion and the frog. They just can't help themselves. And the BDS movement consistently makes its points with classic anti-Semitic canards, tropes, and cartoons and imagery. In fact, unfortunately, there are supporters of that movement. I don't know whether some of you may meet with them, but they're on the Hill. who say things like it's all about the Benjamins, people who support Israel, even though our values and Israeli values are like this, have dual loyalty, even though Israel's support for Israel is for the long-term and short-term benefit of this country. That's how you can tell that the movement is anti-Semitic, and that's why it's so important that we stand up, that we call it what it is, and that we ask our elected representatives to take action about it. So what are you going to ask them to do? There are two resolutions that are currently circulating on the Hill. They're identical. One is in the Senate, one is in the House. So if you have a House meeting, you're going to be asking your member of Congress that you meet with, to the extent they are not already a co-sponsor of the legislation, to co-sponsor, of the resolution, to co-sponsor it. It's H-Res 246. And that is Representative Schneider's bill. You also have, it's bipartisan, Lee Zeldin, Jerry Nadler, and also Congressman Wagner are all supporters. There are already 257 co-sponsors for that resolution on the House side, 136 Democrats, 115 Republicans. So you're going to meet with people if they're already in supporting the resolution. You thank them, ask them to co-sponsor. If they're already co-sponsoring, thank them. Tell them why it's so important that they take a stand through the resolution. On the Senate side, it's S-Res 120. It's by Senators Portman and Cardin, and we're already almost at half the Senate. You got 49 bipartisan co-sponsors, 27 Republicans and 22 Democrats. It would be really great to get 435 and 100. Folks on the House side, you may have a little challenge to get to 435, but we might even be able to do it on the Senate side. Ask them to co-sponsor, thank them for doing it, ask them for their support, and tell them why it's so important. Thank you very much. Have a great day in Washington.